December 11th, 1936. The most eligible bachelor in the world stands before a microphone. The British Empire holds its breath. King Edward VIII is about to say something unprecedented. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. He's giving up his throne. For a twice-divorced American socialite, the first monarch in British history to voluntarily surrender his crown. But tonight, we're going back to where it all began. Welcome to Hearts and History. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable, dim those lights, let the weight of your day just drift away. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for more historical love stories that'll help you sleep. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing our little community is scattered across the globe, all settling in together for some history. Shadows behind the glittering crown. Picture Buckingham Palace, mid-1930s. The corridors echo with hushed conversations about the Prince of Wales. Edward is everything a future king should be, at least on the surface. Devastatingly handsome, charming crowds across the empire. The first truly modern royal. But his father, King George V, watches from the shadows with growing unease. Because behind Edward's golden smile lies something that terrifies the old king, something that could destroy everything. The British monarchy in the 1930s ruled a quarter of the world: India, Canada, Australia, tiny islands scattered across the globe, all held together by one thread, the crown. And George V understood that thread better than anyone. The royal family wasn't just symbolic, they were the living embodiment of British values, Victorian morality, duty above all else. A scandal involving the monarch could shake the entire empire, which is why Edward worried him so much. Edward was born to be king, and he hated it. Oh, he played the part beautifully. Those empire tours in the 20s drew massive crowds. Women swooned. Men admired his common touch. The first royal to truly understand cameras and newsreels. But behind closed doors, he drank heavily, partied relentlessly, and worst of all, he had a pattern, a dangerous pattern of falling for married women, because their unavailability meant he never had to commit to anything real. George V saw it all. The drinking, the reckless affairs, Edward's complete disinterest in constitutional duties. The king reportedly confided to Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin something chilling: "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. 12 months. The old king was watching his heir self-destruct and feeling powerless to stop it. He just didn't know how right he would be, or how wrong, because Edward wouldn't ruin himself, he'd ruin the monarchy. Enter Wallis Simpson. Not yet. Not quite. But she's there, moving through London society like a ghost that will soon become very, very real. Bessie Wallace Warfield, born in Pennsylvania, 1896. Already divorced once from an alcoholic Navy pilot, now married to Ernest Simpson, a shipping executive. They're working their way up through fashionable London circles, business connections opening doors. And one of those doors leads to a house party, where fate is waiting. What was it about her? Historians still argue. She wasn't classically beautiful, but she was elegant, witty, sharp, and here's what made her dangerous to a prince surrounded by sycophants. She was utterly unimpressed by his royal status. That confidence, that refusal to bow and scrape. For a man drowning in courtly protocol, it must have felt like oxygen. Of course she had no idea what she was walking into. None of them did. 1931. The meeting that will change everything. A London house party. The Prince of Wales in his element. Charming and restless. And there's Wallis Simpson, this American socialite who treats royalty like just another dinner guest. They talk, they laugh. Sparks. Not yet. But something shifts in the air. Something that will spiral into obsession scandal, and the abdication that rocks an empire. Neither of them sees it coming. How could they? Love never announces itself. The seeds are planted now. Edward, restless and reckless, drawn to this woman who doesn't worship his title. Wallis, navigating London society, unaware she's just met her destiny. And in Buckingham Palace, King George V grows weaker by the day, his son's behaviour more erratic, the empire holding its breath without knowing why. Because sometimes the most dangerous moments in history look perfectly ordinary when they're happening. George V's health is failing. 1935 slips toward 1936. And in those final months, the old king makes one last haunting prediction about his eldest son, words that will echo through the corridors of history. After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. He doesn't know about Wallis Simpson yet, doesn't know about the crisis brewing, but a father's intuition cuts deep, and sometimes the shadows see what the light cannot. A star-crossed love affair unfolds. 1934, London High Society. Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the British Empire, is about to fall completely apart over a married American woman. Not just attracted to her, obsessed. We're talking about a man who will literally give up the throne of England, but right now, nobody knows. The British press has agreed to total silence. While newspapers across America splash Edward and Wallis across front pages, British subjects read absolutely nothing. It's the strangest media blackout in modern history. Picture this. Edward meets Wallis Simpson at a house party in 1931. She's married to Ernest Simpson, a shipping executive. Nothing dramatic happens immediately, but by 1934 something's shifted. Edward can't stay away from her. He's calling constantly, showing up at her London flat unannounced. Wallis is witty, sharp, completely unimpressed by his royal status. She treats him like any other man, which might be exactly what hooks him. Everyone around Edward bows and scrapes. Wallis? She argues back. What exactly draws the future king to this twice-divorced American? Historians have debated this for decades. She's not conventionally beautiful, not young. She's 38, he's 40. But Wallis has something. Style. Confidence. And according to palace gossip, whispered for years afterward, she may have learned certain intimate skills during time spent in China that Edward finds absolutely irresistible. Whatever it is, the Prince of Wales becomes completely, utterly dependent on her presence. Edward starts showering Wallis with gifts that would make your head spin. We're talking millions of dollars worth of jewellery, emerald bracelets from Cartier, diamond necklaces that belonged to previous queens. He's literally raiding the royal collection, taking pieces that have been in the family for centuries and giving them to his American mistress. The jewellers of London know exactly what's happening. The royal household staff whisper about it constantly, but the British public, complete silence. 1935. Edward decides it's time for Wallis to meet the family. This goes about as well as you'd expect. Queen Mary, his mother, is absolutely horrified. She refuses to receive Wallis at court, won't even acknowledge her existence. King George V, Edward's father, is furious. He reportedly tells advisors that Edward will never actually become king. Whether that's a prediction or a threat, nobody knows, but the royal family's message is crystal clear: this woman is not welcome. The family's icy reception doesn't slow Edward down. If anything, it makes him more defiant. He's bringing Wallis to royal functions anyway, taking her on official trips, treating her like she's already his wife. Palace staff are beside themselves. They're watching the heir to the throne flaunt his affair with a married woman, acting like none of the rules apply to him. And maybe that's exactly what Edward believes. Maybe he thinks being king means never having to choose. Meanwhile, Wallis is getting a crash course in what it means to be involved with royalty. Everywhere she goes, she's watched, followed, photographed by foreign journalists who can't publish in Britain but send everything overseas. American newspapers are having a field day. The Prince's paramour, Edward's American love, but walk down any street in London and ask about Mrs. Simpson, blank stares. The press blackout is holding, for now. What the public doesn't know is that Edward's behaviour is getting more erratic by the month. He's demanding Wallis be present at every event, every meeting, every dinner. Government ministers are quietly panicking. How do you brief the future king when his married American girlfriend is sitting right there? State secrets, constitutional matters, military intelligence, all discussed in front of a woman who has no official role, no security clearance, no sworn loyalty to the crown. By late 1935, Edward isn't even pretending this is casual anymore. He's telling friends that Wallis is the only woman he's ever truly loved, that he can't imagine life without her, that traditional royal marriages are outdated anyway. His staff watch in horror as he systematically dismantles every protocol, every tradition, every careful boundary between public duty and private desire. The storm everyone fears is building, and Edward seems completely oblivious to the thunder. January 1936. King George V dies. Edward becomes King Edward VIII at age 41. Now the stakes are completely different. This isn't the Playboy Prince of Wales anymore. This is the King Emperor, ruler of a quarter of the world's population, head of the Church of England, which forbids divorce, and he's still completely obsessed with Wallis Simpson, who's still married to someone else. The constitutional crisis everyone dreaded. It's about to explode. Behind closed doors, government ministers are holding emergency meetings. How do you handle a king who seems determined to marry a twice-divorced American? The church won't sanction it. Parliament won't accept it. The Dominions are already expressing alarm. But Edward doesn't care about any of that. He's made his choice. Wallis Simpson is going to be his queen, no matter what it costs him. No matter what it costs the empire. The abdication crisis has begun. The unveiling of the royal scandal. December 1936. For 2 years, British newspapers had kept their mouths shut. A gentleman's agreement with press baron Lord Beaverbrook meant British subjects remained officially ignorant while Americans read daily updates about their king's affair. But that silence was about to shatter, and when it did, the explosion would rock the empire to its foundations. Because there's nothing quite like finding out your monarch has been lying to you for 2 years straight. December 3rd. The Bishop of Bradford gives a speech questioning whether the king is spiritually prepared for his coronation. Innocent enough, except every journalist in the room knows exactly what he means. It's the crack in the dam they've been waiting for. Within hours, the press blackout crumbles. Headlines scream across Britain, "The King and Mrs. Simpson." 2 years of pent-up gossip floods the newsstands. The secret is finally out. Picture the shock. Your king, the symbol of the empire, the man whose face is on your money, has been secretly involved with a twice-divorced American socialite for 2 years. While you've been going about your business, completely unaware, the headlines are brutal. The woman who would be queen, Yankee at court. The British press, once protective, turned savage. They've been silenced too long. Now they want blood. The reaction is swift and merciless. Letters pour into newspapers. Angry crowds gather outside Buckingham Palace. "Down with the American woman," they chant. Church congregations pray for the king's moral guidance. The Archbishop of Canterbury prepares stern sermons. This isn't just about Edward anymore. It's about everything Britain stands for. Duty, tradition, moral leadership, all of it threatened by that woman from Baltimore. But here's what gets me about this moment. While Britain erupts in righteous fury, Wallis Simpson is absolutely terrified. She's holed up in her London house, curtains drawn, watching her entire world collapse in real time. Reporters camp outside, Angry crowds gather. Death threats arrive by post. This woman never wanted to be queen, she just wanted to be left alone. But it's far too late for that now. Wallis tries everything to escape. She issues a statement through her lawyer. She's willing to withdraw from the situation entirely. She'll disappear, go back to America, whatever it takes. But Edward won't hear it. The other end of the wicket was determined, her lawyer puts it. The king has made his choice. He's dragging her toward a throne she never wanted, and the whole empire is watching her resist. December 6th. Wallis flees to France. She can't take the pressure anymore. The photographers, the death threats, the hatred in strangers' eyes. From her refuge at the Château de Condé, she watches Britain tear itself apart over her relationship. Friends later say she was nearly hysterical. She begged Edward to find another way. Any other way. But he was past listening to reason. The British dominions weigh in. Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand all reject the idea of Wallis as queen. The church refuses to sanction the marriage. Parliament won't accept it. Even Edward's own family turns against him. His mother, Queen Mary, cuts off all contact with Wallis. The woman is completely isolated, trapped between a king who won't give up and an empire that won't accept her. What's heartbreaking is how desperately Wallis tries to save him from himself. She writes letters begging him to reconsider. She suggests they end the relationship permanently. She offers to disappear forever if it means he can keep his throne. But Edward sees her attempts to withdraw as proof of her selflessness, which only makes him more determined to marry her. It's a trap with no escape. By December 10th, it's over. Edward has chosen. He'll abdicate rather than give up Wallis. The woman who tried everything to prevent this catastrophe finds herself engaged to an ex-king, no longer His Majesty, just the Duke of Windsor. And she'll never be accepted by the royal family, never be received at court, never escape the shadow of the crisis she tried so hard to prevent. The saddest part, Wallis probably could have lived with being Edward's mistress, discreet, private, protected by the old gentleman's agreement with the press. But once that silence broke, once the empire turned against her, there was no going back. She was trapped in a love story she never wanted, heading toward a marriage that would define and confine her for the rest of her life. State secrets, and an unwelcome proposal. Here's what Edward didn't know. British intelligence was listening. Every phone call from the palace, every conversation with Wallis. MI5 had been wiretapping since early 1936, and what they heard worried them. Not just the king discussing state secrets with his mistress, but her responses, her questions, the way she probed for details about government meetings, military plans, diplomatic cables. Special branch officers started following her everywhere, opening her mail, recording her conversations at dinner parties. The surveillance files paint a disturbing picture. Wallis asking pointed questions about British defence capabilities, taking detailed notes during Edward's rambling accounts of cabinet meetings, making phone calls to contacts at the German embassy that lasted hours. Now, maybe she was just naturally curious. Maybe she wanted to understand Edward's world. But intelligence officers weren't taking chances. One memo described her social circle as a clearinghouse for information flowing directly to Berlin. That's not romantic pillow talk, that's espionage. German diplomatic cables, captured after the war, reveal something chilling. Nazi officials believed they had a channel straight to the British throne through 9th Mrs. Simpson's drawing room. They thought Wallis could influence Edward's political views, maybe even policy decisions. Were they right? Edward's loose tongue about classified matters certainly gave them plenty to work with. State secrets discussed over cocktails, military intelligence shared during romantic dinners, the King of England becoming an unwitting intelligence asset for Adolf Hitler. By October 1936, Edward had made his choice. He told Prime Minister Baldwin he intended to marry Wallis Simpson, divorced or not. Baldwin's response was swift and absolute impossible. The king couldn't marry a divorced woman. The church wouldn't perform the ceremony. Parliament wouldn't accept her as queen. The Dominions had already made their position clear, but Edward had a backup plan. Something he thought was brilliant, a morganatic marriage. Marry Wallis, but she wouldn't become queen. No royal title, no succession rights for their children. Edward presented this morganatic marriage idea like he'd solved everything. Wallis gets to be his wife, but the establishment doesn't get their divorced queen. Everybody wins, right? Wrong. Baldwin consulted the Dominion governments, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. Their response was unanimous and brutal. Absolutely not. No exceptions, no compromises, no half measures. The king could marry Mrs. Simpson and abdicate, or he could stay on the throne and give her up. Those were his only options. The empire had spoken. The political uproar was immediate. Emergency meetings at Downing Street, frantic cables between London and the Dominions, Archbishop of Canterbury declaring the marriage impossible on religious grounds, Conservative MPs threatening to revolt if Edward persisted, Labour politicians demanding the king choose between duty and personal desire. The whole constitutional system was grinding toward crisis. And through it all, British intelligence kept monitoring palace phones, documenting every conversation between Edward and the woman who might destroy the monarchy. What's fascinating is how naive Edward seemed about the political firestorm he'd created. He genuinely believed love should conquer all constitutional obstacles. His private secretary tried explaining the gravity of the situation. Edward brushed him off. Cabinet ministers warned about empire-wide crisis. Edward said they'd come around. Meanwhile, his phone calls to Wallis grew more desperate, more frantic. Intelligence transcripts show a man completely detached from reality, promising her a crown he had no power to give. The surveillance reports reveal something else. Wallis was panicking. She never wanted this level of scrutiny, this constitutional crisis, this empire-shaking drama. Intercepted phone calls show her pleading with Edward to be reasonable, to think about his duty, to consider the consequences. But Edward was obsessed, completely fixated. He'd convinced himself that abdication was noble sacrifice rather than selfish abandonment. The intelligence files suggest Wallis saw the truth much more clearly than her supposed lover. November 1936. The crisis deepens daily. British newspapers, finally breaking their gentleman's agreement, start printing stories about the king's romance. Public opinion splits sharply. Some support true love. Others demand royal duty. But behind closed doors, intelligence officials are asking darker questions. Why was Wallis so interested in military secrets? Why did her German contacts seem so well informed about British cabinet discussions? Was this a love story, or something more sinister? The evidence pointed toward both. The government presented Edward with three stark choices. Give up Mrs. Simpson, marry her against ministerial advice causing government resignation and constitutional chaos, or abdicate and marry her as a private citizen. No fourth option, no clever compromises, no morganatic middle ground. Baldwin made clear that if Edward insisted on marriage, the entire government would resign. New elections would be fought on whether Britain wanted a divorced American queen. The establishment was calling Edward's bluff. December approaches. Edward must choose, but intelligence reports suggest the decision might not be entirely about love. German diplomatic cables reference plans for Edward's future usefulness to Nazi interests. Did Edward know? Was he complicit? Or was he just a love-struck fool being manipulated by forces beyond his understanding? The surveillance files can't answer that question. They only document a king choosing personal desire over imperial duty, while enemy agents celebrated in Berlin. The fairy tale was becoming a spy thriller. An impossible choice, love or crown. October 1936. Wallis's second divorce is racing through the courts. Edward's getting desperate. Every day she's not free to marry him feels like torture. He's showering her with royal jewels, demanding constant attention, acting like a lovesick teenager instead of a king. His staff is horrified, the government's in panic mode. And Baldwin? He's about to corner Edward with 3 options that will change everything. None of them good. This is where fairy tales crash into constitutional law. Baldwin walks into the king's study with a face like stone. No pleasantries, just 3 choices laid out like a death sentence. Option 1. Give up Wallis Simpson entirely. Walk away. Pretend this never happened. Option 2. Marry her anyway, against government advice, and watch his ministers resign in protest. Constitutional crisis guaranteed. Option 3. Abdicate the throne. Give up the crown, the empire, everything his family built for 1,000 years. That's it. Those are his choices. Edward stares at Baldwin like he's speaking a foreign language. How can you ask a man to choose between his heart and his birthright? He's been training for this job his entire life. Born to rule an empire that spans a quarter of the globe. Millions of subjects depending on him. His father's dying words echoing in his head. But then there's Wallis, the only woman who's ever made him feel truly alive. The only person who treats him like a man, not a monument. Meanwhile, Wallis is absolutely losing it. She never signed up for this nightmare. According to her later accounts, she's begging Edward to be reasonable. Think about what you're throwing away. Think about your duty. But he's not listening. He's obsessed. She tries fleeing to France to escape the madness, hoping distance might snap him back to reality. Instead, he just gets more determined, more desperate. The woman trying to escape is becoming the excuse for giving up everything. The pressure's mounting from every direction now. Church leaders horrified at the thought of their supreme governor marrying a twice-divorced woman. Dominion governments threatening to cut ties if this goes through. The press finally breaking their silence, turning the whole thing into a feeding frenzy. British intelligence is wiretapping everyone, worried about state secrets leaking through Wallis's social circle. Edward's trapped in a prison of his own making, and the walls are closing in fast. Here's what makes this even more tragic. Edward's always been terrible at commitment. His whole adult life, he's fallen for married women, safe relationships where he could play at romance without real consequences. But Wallis is different. Or maybe she's just the last in a pattern of running away from responsibility. His friends are whispering that he never really wanted to be king anyway. Maybe this crisis is just his escape route, wrapped in the language of grand romance. The weight of 1,000 years of monarchy pressing down on his shoulders. His ancestors conquered empires, survived civil wars, built the greatest royal house in history. Edward is supposed to be the guardian of all that, the living symbol of British values, the thread connecting London to Delhi, to Sydney, to Toronto. One man holding together a global empire, and he's ready to walk away from it all for a woman who might not even want him. Baldwin's not backing down. The government's made its position crystal clear. No compromise, no morganatic marriage where Wallis becomes wife but not queen. The Dominions have voted. The Church has spoken. Parliament won't stand for it. Edward can have his crown or his woman, but he cannot have both. The establishment that raised him, shaped him, gave him everything, is now forcing him to choose what matters most. And they're betting they know what that choice will be. Edward's pacing his study at Fort Belvedere like a caged animal, chain-smoking, barely sleeping. This isn't just about love anymore. It's about who he is as a man. Can he abandon the woman he claims to adore? Can he be the kind of person who throws away love for duty? But then again, can he abandon his people, his family, everything he was born to protect? The crown that's been passed down father to son for generations, stopping with him. The deadline's approaching. Wallis's divorce will be final soon. The government wants an answer. The press is circling like vultures. Edward's brothers are watching their family name get dragged through the mud. His mother, Queen Mary, hasn't spoken to him in weeks. The woman he loves is begging him to be sensible. The country he's supposed to serve is holding its breath. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice is whispering, what if this is all a terrible mistake? December approaches. Edward still wrestling with the choice that will define the rest of his life. Love or crown, passion or duty, the woman who makes him feel human, or the throne that makes him king. Whatever he decides will echo through history, will change the monarchy forever, will either break his heart or break his kingdom. The most eligible bachelor in the world is about to make a choice that no one saw coming and that everyone should have seen from miles away. The Abdication, Love's Triumph or Tragedy. December 10th, 1936. Fort Belvedere. Edward sits at his desk with a pen in his hand and the most important document in British history spread before him. The Instrument of Abdication. 7 paragraphs that will end 1,000 years of royal succession. His 3 brothers watch in silence. No ceremony, no fanfare, just a signature that changes everything. And here's what gets me. He doesn't hesitate. Not for a second. The pen moves across the paper like he's signing a dinner invitation. Think about that moment. Edward Albert Christian, George Andrew Patrick, David Windsor, ex-king. The man who was supposed to rule a quarter of the globe just became the only monarch in British history to voluntarily give up his throne, and he did it for a woman half the world had never heard of 6 months earlier. The sound of that pen on paper, it echoed from London to Sydney to Bombay. 400 million subjects suddenly had a different king, but nobody knew yet. The secret held for 24 hours. December 11th, 1936. Edward faces a microphone in Windsor Castle's Augusta Tower. The BBC is about to broadcast to the largest audience in history, empire-wide, every time zone, every continent where the Union Jack flies. And Edward, he's about to tell them all goodbye. His voice, when it comes, is steady, measured, almost conversational, like he's explaining why he won't be at Sunday dinner. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. Those words hit the airwaves at 10 p.m. London time. In drawing rooms across Britain, families gathered around wireless sets just stopped. Jaws dropped, women gasped, men stared at the radio like it had started speaking Chinese. The king just quit. For an American divorcee, the reactions were instant and brutal. King abdicates screamed every headline from Fleet Street to Times Square. In Parliament, grown men wept openly. The Archbishop of Canterbury called it a grievous blow to the moral force of the crown. Winston Churchill, Edward's friend and ally, sat in stunned silence. Even he hadn't seen this coming. Not really, not the actual signature, not the actual goodbye. The empire was reeling, rudderless. The golden boy had just walked away. But here's where it gets complicated. Because Edward's broadcast, it was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. Every word calculated to make him the romantic hero of the story. The king who chose love over duty. The man who sacrificed everything for his heart. Winston Churchill had helped polish the speech, and it showed. This wasn't raw emotion. This was theatre. Edward knew exactly how he wanted history to remember this moment, and he nailed it. The question that haunted everyone then, and still haunts historians now, was this really about love, or was Edward just looking for an exit? Because let's be honest, the man had never wanted to be king, never shown any real interest in governing. His private secretary once said, Edward treated state papers like unwelcome interruptions to his social life. Maybe Wallis wasn't the reason he abdicated. Maybe she was just his excuse. And Wallis. She was in France when the abdication happened, hiding from photographers at a friend's chateau. When she heard Edward's broadcast, she reportedly burst into tears. Not tears of joy, tears of horror. She'd tried to escape this whole mess weeks earlier, had issued public statements saying she'd withdraw from the situation, but Edward wouldn't let her go. Some romantic hero, right? Forcing the woman he loved into a marriage she didn't want. The Dominions were in chaos. Canada's Prime Minister Mackenzie King called an emergency cabinet meeting. Australia's Joseph Lyons wondered if the empire would survive. South Africa's Herzog saw an opportunity to distance his country from British influence. India's millions learned their Emperor King had quit via crackling radio broadcasts that many couldn't even understand. The constitutional crisis Edward created rippled across 6 continents. All for love, he said. But at what cost? Within hours of the abdication, Edward was packing. No lingering goodbyes, no gradual transition. He boarded HMS Fury at Portsmouth on December 12th, exactly 2 days after signing away his birthright. As the destroyer pulled away from British shores, Edward stood on deck, watching his homeland disappear. He'd return as a visitor, a tourist in his own former kingdom. The Duke of Windsor now, not even allowed to use his family name. So was it love's triumph or tragedy? Maybe both. Edward got his woman, but lost his purpose. Wallis got her king, but never wanted him. The empire got a new monarch in George VI, who turned out to be exactly what they needed for the coming war. History moved forward, but something was broken that December night. The magic of monarchy, the idea that duty comes before desire, Edward had shattered that forever. And for what? We're still not sure. Exile in the guised aftermath. June 3rd, 1937. Château de Condé, France. Edward and Wallis finally marry. But here's what's wild about this wedding. Not a single member of the British royal family shows up. Not his mother, not his brothers. Nobody. The man who gave up an empire for love gets married like he's some distant relative they'd rather forget. And that's just the beginning, because what comes next isn't the fairy tale ending everyone expected. It's something much stranger, a life of luxury wrapped in permanent exile. The ceremony itself was almost pathetic. 17 guests total. The bride wore a pale blue dress that cost more than most people's houses. The groom, still calling himself king, still signing documents Edward RID, even though that signature meant nothing. Now, the wedding photos show 2 people trying desperately to look happy, while the world watched their humiliation. Because make no mistake, this wasn't a celebration. This was the British establishment's way of saying, you made your choice, now live with it, completely, utterly, alone. Then came the real punishment. George VI creates Edward the Duke of Windsor, but here's the twist. Wallis gets nothing. She's not Her Royal Highness. She's just Mrs. Windsor. Think about that. Edward gave up being Emperor of India, King of England, head of the Commonwealth, and they won't even give his wife the basic courtesy title that every other duke's wife gets automatically. It was personal, it was petty, and it worked. Because Edward spent the next 35 years trying to get that title for her. The royal family's message was crystal clear: you're dead to us. No Christmas invitations, no state visits, no family weddings, nothing. Edward's own mother, Queen Mary, wouldn't receive Wallis ever. His brother, the new king, kept him at arm's length. Even when Edward came back to England for funerals, Wallis wasn't welcome. They'd made him choose between the throne and the woman. Fine, but they'd also make sure he never forgot what that choice cost him. Complete social annihilation. October 1937. Here's where it gets really ugly. Edward and Wallis visit Nazi Germany. They tour factories, meet with officials, and yes, they meet Hitler himself. The photographs are devastating. Edward giving what looks suspiciously like a Nazi salute. Wallis shaking hands with Heinrich Himmler. They claim it was just tourism, just curiosity, but British intelligence is watching, taking notes, building a file that will haunt them forever. Because this isn't just embarrassing anymore. This is starting to look like treason. When war breaks out in 1939, the British government has a problem. What do you do with an ex-king who might be a Nazi sympathizer? You can't arrest him. He's still royal. You can't ignore him. He's too dangerous. So they get creative. July 1940. Edward becomes governor of the Bahamas. Sounds impressive, right? It's not. It's exile disguised as a promotion. They're parking him on a tropical island, 3,000 miles from Europe, where he can't cause any real damage. Gilded prison, population 2. Life in Nassau was complicated. On paper, they were living like royalty. Beautiful house, staff, official functions. But Edward hated every minute of it. He was bored, frustrated, drinking too much. Wallis was going crazy with the heat and the isolation. They hosted dinner parties where the guests were colonial administrators and local businessmen. These people who'd given up an empire for each other were making small talk about sugar exports and tourism development. The glamour was suffocating them. After the war ended, they became professional exiles. Paris, New York, the French Riviera, always guests, never quite belonging anywhere. They attended charity galas and society parties where people whispered behind their backs. Wallis would hold court in her Paris drawing room, surrounded by people who came for the novelty of meeting the woman who'd toppled a king. Edward would tell the same stories about his brief reign, growing more bitter each year. They had money, status, recognition, but no purpose, no meaning. The fight over Wallis's title consumed Edward completely. He wrote letters, made demands, threatened to publish memoirs, anything to force his family to give Wallis the royal highness she'd never received. It became his obsession, not world peace or charity work or anything meaningful. Just 3 little words, Her Royal Highness. The man who'd ruled an empire was spending his retirement fighting bureaucratic battles over protocol and losing every single time. The royal family never budged, not once. Friends later said the marriage was hollow. Edward worshipped Wallis, but she seemed increasingly cold toward him. There were rumours of affairs on both sides, separate bedrooms, long silences at dinner parties. Wallis reportedly told friends she'd never really loved him, that she'd been trapped by his obsession and the scandal that made normal life impossible. Whether that's true, who knows, but something was definitely wrong. They'd gotten everything they thought they wanted, and somehow it wasn't enough. So there you have it. The greatest love story of the century turns out to be, what exactly? A cautionary tale about the price of defying duty? A tragedy about 2 people who destroyed everything for a romance that might not have been real? Or just the messy reality of what happens after the fairy tale ends? Edward gave up a throne, Wallis gave up her reputation, and they spent 35 years in beautiful, luxurious, golden exile, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. The Nazi allegations, a dark undertone. October 1937. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor step off a train in Munich. They're guests of the Third Reich now, officially touring German labour programmes. Unofficially? This is about to become one of the most damaging photo ops in royal history. The pictures that emerge from this trip, they'll haunt them forever. Edward shaking hands with Hitler, both of them giving Nazi salutes. Wallis smiling beside SS officers. At the time it seemed like diplomacy. After the war, it looked like collaboration. This is where the fairy tale gets very, very dark. Here's what we know about Edward's politics before the abdication. He admired strong leadership, thought democracy was messy, inefficient. He'd made comments about the need for firm government, about how Britain could learn from Germany's economic recovery. Some called it pragmatic, others saw warning signs. His private secretary resigned over Edward's casual attitude toward state secrets. Palace staff whispered about sensitive documents left lying around, information that somehow found its way into conversations with German diplomats. The intelligence services were already watching him. The Nazi visit just confirmed their worst fears about their former king. The invitation came through Charles Bedaux, a French-American industrialist with Nazi connections. He offered to host the couple in France, then suggested the German tour. Educational purposes, he said. See how the Reich handled unemployment and housing. Edward was intrigued. Wallis, the records are murky about her enthusiasm. Some accounts suggest she was reluctant, worried about appearances. Others claim she was curious about Hitler personally. What's clear is that once Edward decided to go, she went along, as she always did. Even when the destination was Nazi Germany, even when the optics were catastrophic. October 22nd, 1937. Berchtesgaden. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor meet Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat. The conversation lasts over an hour. No official transcript exists, but German records suggest Edward expressed admiration for German social programs and criticized British democracy. Hitler reportedly found him sympathetic, though somewhat weak. Wallis said little during the meeting, later describing Hitler as mesmerizing but frightening. The photos tell the story, the words cannot. Edward's relaxed smile, the casual Nazi salutes. Two people who clearly felt comfortable in the heart of the Third Reich. Comfortable enough to be photographed there. The British government was horrified. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain called the visit most unfortunate. King George VI privately raged about his brother's stupidity. The press coverage was mixed. Some outlets praised the Duke's efforts at peacemaking. Others questioned his judgment. American newspapers were particularly critical. The New York Times called it regrettable. But the full damage wouldn't be clear until after the war, when captured German documents revealed the true extent of Nazi interest in the former king, when Operation Willy came to light, when the world learned Hitler had plans for Edward VIII, plans that would have made him a puppet ruler of occupied Britain. Operation Willy. Summer 1940. France has fallen. Britain stands alone. The Duke and Duchess are in Spain, nominally heading to his new post as governor of the Bahamas. German intelligence sees an opportunity. SS General Walter Schellenberg is tasked with keeping Edward in Europe. The plan? If Germany invades Britain successfully, reinstall Edward as king under Nazi control. The documents are chilling in their detail. Hitler believed Edward would cooperate, would provide legitimacy for German occupation. Whether Edward knew about these plans remains unclear, but German confidence in his cooperation suggests conversations that went beyond polite diplomatic chit-chat. The Duke's response to Nazi approaches varied depending on who's telling the story. British intelligence reports suggest he was tempted by German promises to restore his status. His titles, his place in history. German documents claim he criticised British war leadership, suggested peace negotiations might be wise. Edward's own post-war statements denied everything, claimed he was loyal throughout. Wallis barely appears in these records at all. She's mentioned as being present, as sharing Edward's views, but never as an independent voice. Always the accompanist, never the soloist. Even in potential treason, she remained in his shadow. Winston Churchill, newly Prime Minister, moved quickly. He couldn't arrest a former king, couldn't risk a public trial that might reveal the full extent of Edward's Nazi contacts. Instead, he offered a face-saving solution, the governorship of the Bahamas, a prestigious exile, far from Europe, far from German agents, far from temptation. Edward initially resisted, wanted to stay closer to the action, but pressure from Churchill, from his brother the king, from the weight of accumulating evidence, finally convinced him. By August 1940, the Duke and Duchess were sailing to Nassau. The potential puppet king was safely out of Hitler's reach. The Nazi documents weren't released until after the war. When they emerged in the late 1950s, they devastated what remained of Edward's reputation. The romantic narrative of the abdication suddenly looked different. Had he given up the throne for love? Or had he been an unreliable king whose departure probably saved Britain from disaster? The evidence was damning, but not definitive. Edward sued newspapers that suggested active treason. He won some cases, lost others. Wallis said even less, claiming ignorance of political discussions. She'd learned the value of silence. Some secrets are too dangerous to share, even decades later. The impact on their post-war lives was profound. Invitations dried up. Former friends became distant. The royal family's coldness intensified. They weren't just embarrassing relatives anymore, they were potential security risks. Even in exile, even in their glittering Paris salons, the shadow of those Nazi connections followed them. Wallis aged into bitter resentment, blaming Britain for their isolation, while carefully avoiding discussion of why that isolation might be justified. Edward retreated into self-pity, claiming he'd been misunderstood, misrepresented. The great love story had acquired a stain that wouldn't wash clean. Some choices echo forever. Here's what makes this so tragic. Strip away the politics, the Nazi connections, the security concerns. You're left with two people who chose each other over everything else and spent 40 years paying for that choice. Edward gave up a throne. Wallis gave up her privacy, her safety, her chance at a normal life. They got each other, but they also got exile, suspicion, and the knowledge that their greatest moment of happiness had been built on quicksand. Love stories aren't supposed to end with accusations of treason. But sometimes history has other plans. Sometimes even fairy tales have very dark endings. The years of discontent, a life in limbo. Paris, 1946. The war's over, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor are back to what they do best, floating. Between their rented mansion on the Bois de Boulogne and their New York apartment, between cocktail parties and charity galas, between moments of desperate boredom disguised as sophisticated leisure, Edward tells everyone who will listen that he's never regretted a thing, never looked back. But watch him at these parties. There's something hollow behind those practiced smiles. Picture their routine. Wake up late. Wallis spends hours getting dressed. Every detail perfect. Edward reads newspapers obsessively, looking for mentions of himself, of his family back in England. Lunch with society friends. Afternoon shopping or museum visits. Evening parties where they're always the most famous people in the room. Sounds glamorous, right? But here's the thing about having nothing to do. It gets old fast. And these two, they had decades of nothing ahead of them. The money situation was weird. Edward had negotiated a decent settlement when he abdicated, plus income from his Duchy of Cornwall investments. They lived well, but not like royalty. Not like he'd grown up expecting. Wallis became obsessed with jewellery, with having the most elegant wardrobe, with proving they still mattered. Every party was a performance. Every photograph an attempt to show the world what Britain had given up. The problem? The world was moving on without them. Then there were the affairs, or rumours of affairs. It's hard to know what was real versus what Paris gossips invented. But by the early 1950s, people whispered about Edward and various society women, about Wallis and younger men, about separate bedrooms and separate lives held together by public necessity. Neither ever confirmed anything. But friends noticed the tension, the sharp comments, the way they'd arrive at parties separately and barely speak all evening. What really ate at Edward was the recognition thing. The British royal family still refused to call Wallis Her Royal Highness, refused to receive them officially, refused to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, they'd been too harsh. Edward would bring this up constantly, at dinner parties, in interviews, in letters to his family that went unanswered. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about a man who'd given up everything and still wasn't sure it had been worth it. Wallis handled the exile differently. She threw herself into being the perfect hostess, the most elegant woman in the room. Her parties became legendary, but in a hollow way, all surface, no substance. She collected famous friends like trophies, writers, artists, politicians, anyone who made her feel important. But late at night, when the guests went home, what was left? A woman in her 50s, married to a man she maybe never loved, trapped in a life she never wanted. The 1950s brought a new generation of royals who made Edward look increasingly irrelevant. Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II in 1952. Young, dutiful, everything Edward hadn't been. The contrast was brutal. Here was someone taking the job he'd walked away from, and doing it well. Edward watched from Paris as his niece became the face of the modern monarchy. The empire he'd abandoned was thriving without him. That had to sting. But here's what gets me about this period. They kept trying, kept hosting parties, kept travelling, kept pretending they were living their best lives. Edward wrote his memoirs, spinning the Abdication as the greatest love story ever told. Wallis did interviews talking about their perfect marriage. But people who knew them well, they saw through it. The forced smiles, the separate interests, the way they'd light up when apart and dim when together. By the 1960s, they'd settled into a kind of routine disappointment. Edward gardening obsessively at their country house outside Paris. Wallis redecorating constantly, changing wallpaper and furniture like she was trying to redecorate her entire life. They had no children, no real purpose, no legacy except the scandal they'd caused 30 years earlier. Friends described dinners where they'd sit in silence, nothing left to say to each other. The cruelest irony. Edward claimed he'd chosen love over duty, but what he'd really chosen was limbo. Neither fully royal nor fully free, neither completely British nor completely American, neither divorced from his past nor committed to his future. He'd thought walking away from the throne would solve his problems. Instead, it had frozen him in time, trapped him in a moment of choice he could never unmake. So when Edward insisted he had no regrets, when he told journalists he'd do it all again, was he lying, or was he just trying to convince himself? Because admitting regret would mean admitting he'd thrown away the greatest job in the world for a marriage that had curdled into mutual endurance, that the fairy tale had become a prison, that sometimes love isn't enough, and for a man like Edward, that truth might have been unbearable. Legacy of a Love Story, The End and Beyond, May 28th, 1972. Paris. Edward Windsor dies in his bed at age 77, with Wallis holding his hand. The man who gave up a throne for love slips away quietly, far from the crown he abandoned 36 years earlier. Queen Elizabeth II had visited him just 10 days before, their first meeting since the abdication. Too little, too late, maybe, but Wallis finally had what she'd always wanted, recognition. The Queen called her Aunt Wallis for the first time. Small gestures matter when you've waited decades. Edward's funeral at St. George's Chapel was complicated. Full royal honours, but Wallis sits alone. The woman for whom a king abdicated, now 75 and frail, watching as Britain buries the man who chose her over everything. She looks lost, confused. The early signs of dementia are already showing. After the service, she returns to Paris, to that grand house on the Bois de Boulogne, where she'll spend 14 more years, mostly alone, mostly forgotten, her mind slowly slipping away from the memories that defined her. Those final 14 years were heartbreaking. Wallis, the woman who'd captivated a king with her wit and charm, gradually loses herself to dementia. By the 1980s, she doesn't remember Edward, doesn't remember the abdication, doesn't remember being the most famous woman in the world. Her French staff cares for her gently, but she's essentially a prisoner in her own mind. The sharp tongue that once cut through royal protocol, silent. The woman who changed history, gone. Only the shell remains, waiting. April 24th, 1986. Wallis dies at 89, alone except for her nurses. No family, no friends from the old days. The auction of her belongings becomes a spectacle. Hundreds of pieces of royal jewellery that Edward had showered on her, letters, photographs, remnants of their extraordinary life together. Bidders fight over fragments of their love story. But here's what matters. Queen Elizabeth II makes a decision that would have seemed impossible 40 years earlier. Wallis will be buried beside Edward at Frogmore, on royal ground. Think about that for a second. The woman the establishment called that woman, the twice-divorced American who nearly destroyed the monarchy, finally gets her place in royal history. Not as a footnote, not as a cautionary tale. As Edward's wife, their headstone simply reads Edward and Wallis. No titles, no royal styling, just two names side by side, finally at peace on British soil. After decades of exile, decades of rejection, their home, the monarchy that cast them out, welcomed them back in death. So what's their legacy? Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. Edward's abdication saved Britain from a king who might have been disastrous during World War II. His Nazi sympathies, his weak character, his complete lack of understanding about constitutional duty. Imagine him on the throne during the Blitz. George VI, thrust into kingship he never wanted, became exactly the monarch Britain needed. Sometimes the most selfish acts have the most fortunate consequences. Edward's love story accidentally preserved the monarchy he abandoned, but their impact goes deeper. Edward established a new rule for royalty duty, before desire. Every member of the royal family since 1936 has lived under the shadow of his choice. When Princess Margaret wanted to marry divorced Peter Townsend in the 1950s, the answer was no. When Charles struggled with his marriage to Diana while loving Camilla, he stayed married for years. Edward's abdication became the cautionary tale. Love might be important, but the crown comes first. Personal happiness? Secondary, always. You can trace the line directly to today's royal dramas. Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties? The press immediately called it another abdication. Charles finally marrying Camilla after decades, only possible because he proved his dedication to duty first. William and Kate's careful courtship, shaped by the understanding that personal choices have constitutional consequences. Edward and Wallis didn't just change their own lives, they changed the rules for everyone who came after. Their love story became everyone else's limitation. The cultural impact is fascinating. Their story gets retold constantly. Movies, books, documentaries, each generation finding new meaning in their choices. In the 1930s, it was scandal. In the 1960s, romance. In the 1980s, after Diana and Charles married, it became a story about the cost of arranged royal marriages. Today, post Meghan and Harry, it's about institutions versus individuals. Same facts, different meanings. The story survives because it touches something universal, the tension between love and duty, passion and responsibility. But here's what haunts me about their ending. Edward and Wallis got what they wanted. 35 years together, freedom from royal duty, the chance to live as they chose. Yet something was always missing. The constant parties, the endless travel, the recurring depression. It felt hollow. Edward spent decades trying to regain the status he'd abandoned. Wallis reportedly confided she'd never truly loved him. Maybe the fairy tale was always an illusion. Maybe love alone isn't enough to build a life. Maybe some prices are too high, even for happiness. As you drift off tonight, consider this. Edward and Wallis achieved the impossible, a love story that toppled a king, changed a monarchy, and captivated the world. They're buried together now, finally at peace on royal ground, their names carved in stone side by side. Was it worth it? The exile, the pain, the decades of regret. History will debate that forever, but maybe that's the point. The greatest love stories don't have perfect endings. They have endings that make us think, make us question, make us wonder what we'd choose if faced with impossible decisions.